The diner smelled of burnt coffee and grease, the kind of place where stories usually died in silence. But on that day, every eye in the room caught the same sight: a young waiter balancing plates with only one working hand. Ethan Carter's other arm was trapped in a cast, stiff against his chest. He moved slowly at home, painfully, yet forced a smile so thin it looked more like a mask. Customers whispered between themselves, pity flashing across their faces, but no one dared to intervene. They saw a boy struggling, but they did not see the truth. They did not know why his hand was broken. Ross, the manager, stood near the counter, eyes sharp with cruelty. His words slashed through the clatter of dishes. Clumsy gay boy, useless as ever. The insult hung heavy in the air. Some customers turned their heads away, ashamed to look. But Ross's smirk only widened. Ethan kept moving, his cast bumping against trays, his body flinching each time, as though the pain was more than physical. He knew better than to answer. He knew silence was survival. What no one realized was that the broken hand was no accident at all. Ross had snapped the bone himself, punishing Ethan after catching him overhear something he should never have heard: proof of money missing from the diner's accounts. Ethan had stumbled into that secret by mistake, but the price he paid was carved into the white plaster around his arm. Still, he came to work each day, shoulders stiff, heart heavy, forcing himself to stand upright while humiliation rained down. His presence became a spectacle, half pity, half shame for the strangers who ordered eggs and coffee without knowing the storm that brewed beneath the surface. And yet, in the far corner, someone did know. A man with hair as silver as the edge of winter, his back straight like an old soldier's. His name was Harold Whitman. To everyone else, he was just another quiet customer, the man who sat in the corner booth and stirred his coffee too long. But as his eyes followed Ethan's trembling movements, there was nothing casual about his gaze. Harold was watching, silently, deliberately, the way only a man trained by war would observe. He saw every detail others missed: the wince Ethan hid behind his smile, the way Ross lingered too close, not to manage but to remind the boy of fear. Harold's jaw tightened each time Ross raised his voice. Still, he said nothing. He knew better than to act without knowing the whole story. But inside, a memory clawed its way back of another young man, long ago, who had also carried himself with fragile pride while the world mocked him. Ethan did not know he was being studied. He only knew the weight of survival. Every plate he carried, every insult he swallowed, became proof that he still existed. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his spirit clung to the small dignity of finishing his shift without collapse. The broken hand was not just a wound, it was a reminder of how fragile justice could be when no one dared to speak. Yet in that moment, as Harold's eyes stayed locked on him, something unseen was shifting. Ethan thought he was alone in that diner. He thought the cast on his arm was the proof of his silence. But in the shadows of the corner booth, a promise was forming. Someone was watching who would not let the cruelty remain hidden forever. If you are still here listening to Ethan's story, remember to follow Hart's story for more voices like his. Stories that remind us how fragile dignity can be and how powerful it becomes when someone refuses to look away. Because in the cracks of silence, justice often begins to take root. Harold Whitman had spent years in that booth, a shadow folded into the background of the diner. To others, he was nothing more than a habit, the old man who ordered black coffee and sat in silence, day after day, as though the world outside had little claim on him. But Harold carried within him a discipline shaped by years in uniform. He had once believed in watching, in letting the truth rise when no one suspected it was being seen, only when people think no eyes are on them. He had told fellow soldiers long ago, do they reveal who they really are? That belief had become his method. He let time speak. He let the diner unfold around him, recording its rhythms in silence. He had seen Ross bark orders at every waiter, but something about the way he singled out Ethan Carter carried a venom beyond ordinary management. He watched the way Ross's insults sharpened whenever Ethan's back was turned, How the sneer deepened when he used the word gay, making the insult not just professional, but personal in those weeks. Harold's gaze returned again and again to Ethan. The boy never answered back. He swallowed Ross's cruelty, kept moving with his cast pressed tight against his body, and worked harder than the others as though effort could shield him from suspicion. Harold had lived long enough to recognize a certain expression, the hollow look in Ethan's eyes, the one a man wears when he is cornered, when he carries his pain quietly because speaking would only invite more damage. It was not just pity that is stirred in Harold. It was recognition. Decades earlier, on a battlefield oceans away, Harold had fought beside a soldier whose bravery was never written into medals because he lived in a time when being gay erased a man's worth in the eyes of those who commanded him. That friend had carried the same quiet resilience, the same mixture of pride and fear. He had been silenced by a world unwilling to accept his truth, and Harold had buried his memory with the bitterness of knowing justice had never arrived for him. Now, sitting in the booth of a small-town diner, Harold saw that same silence mirrored in Ethan's trembling hands. One night, as the neon sign buzzed against the glass and most of the staff had gone home, Harold lingered. The diner had thinned to a few stragglers, the kind who drank coffee until midnight out of habit more than need. Ross sat in his office, door cracked open, voice low but thick with arrogance. Harold shifted slightly, angling his hearing toward the sound. He caught the words clearly enough to burn them into memory. Ross was laughing, his tone careless, as if cruelty itself had become entertainment. "That gay kid won't say a word," he boasted to a man whose chuckle echoed faintly. The broken hand was a lesson. He knows better now. The words froze Harold in place. His fist clenched beneath the table until his knuckles ached. In all his years of waiting, all his patience to let truth expose itself, never had the evidence been so plain, so brutal. He had suspected Ross, but to hear him admit it, to hear the laughter roll out as though breaking a young man's body was nothing more than a managerial tactic, made Harold's chest burn with anger. Still, he did not stand then. He did not storm into the office. He kept his soldiers' patience, for he understood the difference between rage and justice. Evidence mattered. Timing mattered. But that night, Harold walked out into the cool air with his jaw set, knowing something had shifted. He had crossed from watching into deciding. He would no longer remain only an observer. From that moment, Harold's silence became a shield for Ethan rather than a cage. He began to trace Ross's movements with sharper attention. He noted the ledgers Ross carried under his arm, the calls he made, the smug way he pocketed envelopes. Each detail collected itself into a picture Harold could not ignore. Ethan had been turned into a scapegoat, a vessel for Ross's corruption, and the boy's broken arm was only one piece of a cruelty far wider than the diner walls. Harold had lived long enough to know that silence could protect as much as it could destroy. He remembered men who had kept their heads down, who had endured torment until endurance became their only identity. Some survived, but some were crushed by it. Watching Ethan absorb insult after insult, Harold knew the boy was standing on that fragile line. He could endure a little longer, but not forever. Someone had to act before silence swallowed him whole. The lesson Harold carried into that night was simple but sharp. Watching could reveal the truth, but truth alone did not heal wounds. It was action timely, deliberate, undeniable that could shift the weight of cruelty back onto the shoulders of the guilty. He had once failed a friend by watching too long. He would not repeat that mistake with Ethan Carter. The diner slept under the dim hum of its neon sign, but Harold Whitman did not. His mind replayed Ross's careless laughter, every word confirming what his instincts had already known. That night, when the last car left the lot and the silence wrapped itself around the cracked parking lines, Harold rose from his booth and walked with deliberate calm toward the office at the back. He carried himself with the precision of a man who had once slipped through enemy lines, alert to every creak of the floor. The office door resisted his push, but the lock was as worn as the paint that flaked from its frame. Inside, the air was thick with the stale odor of cigarettes and the faint sting of spilled whiskey. Piles of paperwork spread across the desk in uneven stacks. Harold's eyes scanned the pages, trained to notice patterns others overlooked. The first file he opened carried Ethan Carter's name, his handwriting shaky where it was required, his signature placed at the bottom of forms that accused him of repeated mistakes, shortages in the register, missing supplies, even complaints from customers that felt suspiciously similar in tone. The truth unfolded with brutal clarity. Ross had not only stolen, he had constructed an entire paper trail to bury Ethan beneath the weight of blame. It was all their falsified reports that painted Ethan as careless, receipts adjusted by hand, and cash balances that never quite aligned. The trap was elegant in its cruelty, for each false entry disguised Ross's theft as Ethan's incompetence. A boy already vulnerable for who he was had been turned into a shield for a man's greed. Harold's pulse tightened as he pulled open a drawer, uncovering a ledger scrawled in Ross's uneven script. The numbers swayed between columns, but the gaps shouted louder than words. Money had vanished in amounts too consistent to be error. Ross had been draining the diner steadily, and whenever questions might arise, Ethan's name was scribbled in the margins like a scapegoat branded in ink. The soldier in Harold recognized the cruelty of the tactic. Corruption was never only about theft, it was about destroying the one least able to fight back. He thought again of Ethan's cast, of the boy's trembling smile as he carried plates one-handed while Ross smirked. It was not just humiliation. It was a calculated effort to crush his spirit, to silence him permanently. Harold's decision solidified in that moment. He gathered copies, slid evidence into his jacket, and replaced the files with the precision of a man accustomed to covering his tracks. He knew exactly where this evidence belonged, not just in the hands of management, for he himself was the owner, but in the hands of those who carried the law. Ross had crossed from petty cruelty into criminal betrayal. Yet even as Harold prepared to make his move, it was not the stolen dollars that weighed most heavily on his conscience. Money could be recovered. Businesses could rebuild. What haunted him was the image of Ethan's eyes, those eyes that bore the same quiet resilience he had once seen in the trenches beside Michael Carter, his fallen friend. Michael had been a soldier who never received the recognition he deserved because of who he loved. He had died carrying a truth the world refused to honor. Harold had lived with that silence pressing on his chest for decades. Now, in Ethan, Harold saw that history trying to repeat itself in another form. Different battlefield, different weapons, but the same injustice, a young gay man forced into silence, carrying wounds inflicted by those who should never have held power over him. Harold felt the weight of his own years pressing down, reminding him that time does not always grant second chances. But perhaps this was the moment he could act where once he had been powerless. When dawn broke, Harold had already spoken to the police. He had laid the files bare, described the injuries, given names, dates, and accounts. The officers did not know the depth of his fury, nor the ghost that stood behind his words, but they understood enough to prepare their case. Ross's arrogance had blinded him to the truth that the quiet man in the corner booth was more than a customer. He was a witness. He was the owner, and he was no longer willing to be silent. Harold stepped back into the diner that morning with a calm that masked the storm within. He watched Ethan move carefully between tables, still smiling that brittle smile, still hiding the tremor that lived in his shoulders. Ethan believed no one saw him. He believed he was alone. But Harold knew better now. The evidence was gathered, the law was coming, and the boy who had been forced to carry shame that was never his would soon see the truth revealed. What Harold carried in that moment was more than justice for a diner. It was the knowledge that silence in the face of cruelty makes a man complicit. He had once lived with that guilt, and it had cost him a friend. This time, he would choose differently. This time, his silence had ended. The diner filled slowly that morning, the kind of steady crowd that blurred into the rhythm of coffee poured and plates clattering against the counter. Ethan Carter moved through it all with his usual fragile grace, the cast still strapped tight against his chest, the effort of every step hidden beneath that thin smile he had taught himself to wear. He did not expect the day to be any different from the ones before. He braced for Ross's sharp tongue, for the sting of humiliation disguised as management, and for the silence of those who noticed but never spoke. But as the clock edged toward midday, a sudden shift broke the routine. Harold Whitman rose from his corner booth, the same booth he had occupied for months. Only this time his presence demanded attention. He tapped a spoon gently against the glass, a sound so clear it cut through the hum of chatter and pulled every gaze toward him. Ethan paused mid-step, confusion flickering across his face. Ross stiffened near the register, a flash of irritation passing his expression, as though the old man's act was an interruption to his control. Harold's voice carried not with volume, but with a steady weight that settled into every ear. He announced what no one in the room had ever suspected. He was not a drifter of habit, nor a silent customer haunting a corner booth. He was the true owner of the diner. The room fell into stunned silence. Ethan's breath caught. Ross's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. Then Harold laid bare the truth, piece by piece. He held up the falsified records, the receipts that carried Ethan's name like stains, the ledger marked with thefts disguised as errors. He spoke plainly of what Ross had done, of the money siphoned, of the loss written in Ethan's hand, and of the violence that had left the young man's bones broken as a warning never to speak. The customers who had whispered pity days earlier now stared in shock, their eyes snapping toward Ross with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Ross tried to laugh it off, his words sharp and defensive. But before he could spin another excuse, the door opened and uniformed officers entered. Harold had timed it with precision. The police moved quickly, their hands firm as they seized Ross's arms and pulled them behind his back. The click of handcuffs echoed louder than any insult Ross had ever thrown. Gasps rippled across the diner, followed by an unexpected sound applause. Customers who had sat in silence for weeks now rose to their feet, clapping as Ross was led out into the daylight, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. Ethan stood frozen, his tray still balanced awkwardly in his one good hand, his eyes wide as the world he thought unchangeable cracked apart in an instant. For the first time in months, the insults did not fall on him. The burden he carried was lifted by someone else's voice, and it was almost too much to bear. His lips trembled as tears rose, unbidden, slipping past the smile he could no longer hold. In their place came something raw, something Ethan had not allowed himself to feel for so long: relief. Harold turned then, his eyes softening as they settled on the boy. He spoke not to the crowd, but to Ethan alone. "You've carried this place with one hand," he said, his voice steady, every syllable shaped by sincerity. "From now on, you will not carry it as a waiter. You will stand as floor manager." The words crashed into Ethan with the force of revelation. He had never imagined himself as anything more than the boy everyone overlooked, the worker they pitied or mocked. Now, standing in the center of a diner that finally saw him, he was being offered dignity. His body shook as the weight of years, the insults, the silence, the fear began to loosen their grip. For the first time, his smile was not a mask. It was real, born of something deeper than survival. The customers clapped again, but this time it was not for Ross's downfall. It was for Ethan's rise. The young man who had been humiliated, dismissed, and broken now stood taller, though his arms still rested in plaster. The cast no longer looked like a prison. It looked like proof that wounds did not define the worth of the one who bore them. What happened in that diner was more than an act of justice. It was a reminder that silence in the face of cruelty only extends its power. When truth is spoken aloud, when evidence replaces whispers, even the smallest corners of the world can change. Ethan's tears did not mark weakness. They marked release, the moment when a life bent by fear began to straighten. The diner breathed differently in the days that followed. Where once whispers of pity followed Ethan Carter through the aisles, now there was recognition. Customers greeted him with warmth, not out of sympathy but respect. They nodded as he passed, thanked him with voices that carried gratitude instead of pity. He no longer moved like a shadow pressed into corners. He walked with the quiet dignity of someone finally allowed to stand without fear. His caste remained, a reminder of the pain he had endured. But no one saw him as broken anymore. They saw him as someone who had survived. A week after Ross was led away in handcuffs, Harold Whitman asked Ethan to sit with him in the quiet of the closed diner. The neon sign hummed faintly outside, casting its glow against the empty booths. Ethan approached with curiosity, unsure why the old man who had changed his life now looked weighed by something even deeper. Harold set a plain envelope on the table, but before sliding it across, he began to speak. He told Ethan of years long past, of a battlefield far from home, and of a man he had once loved more than words could admit in that time. His name was Michael Carter. He was Ethan's uncle, though Ethan had never been told. To the world, Michael was just another soldier lost, buried beneath silence. But to Harold, he was everything: a friend, a brother in arms, a man whose courage was matched only by the cruelty of a world that refused to honor him for who he truly was. Michael had died carrying that silence, his sacrifice left unspoken in the history books. Harold's voice faltered as he explained how he had recognized Ethan's eyes from the very first day. The same unyielding light, the same quiet endurance. It was as though Michael had returned in another form, still standing against the weight of prejudice. Harold slid the envelope toward him then. Inside was not only the official document appointing Ethan as floor manager, but a portion of ownership to the diner itself. Michael's blood should not be forgotten, Harold said softly, and his family should not be left to carry shame. You are his legacy, Ethan. You are proof that his spirit endures. The weight of it broke something inside Ethan, but not in despair. His tears came not from humiliation this time, but from the release of years he had carried alone. For the first time, he did not feel like the outcast others had labeled him. He was no longer just the boy mocked for who he was. He was the heir to a story of love, of sacrifice, of resilience that had survived long enough to reach him. The diner was no longer only a workplace. It was a place where the silenced had finally been heard. As days turned into weeks, Ethan found his reflection in the diner's windows no longer foreign. He saw a young man who had survived cruelty, who had been lifted by truth, and who now carried the weight of legacy with pride. The customers sensed it too. When they spoke to him, they did not lower their voices in pity. They addressed him as a man who had earned his place, and Ethan, for the first time, allowed himself to believe it. The story of Ross's downfall faded in the gossip of the town, but the story of Ethan's rise remained. He became not just the boy who survived injustice, but the man who carried the name Carter forward with dignity. And Harold, watching from the corner booth he still claimed each morning, no longer carried the guilt of silence. He had done what he could not do. Decades ago he had spoken, he had acted, and he had preserved the memory of the one he loved by giving the next generation the strength to stand tall. In the end, the lesson was clear to anyone who watched. Cruelty thrives when silence protects it. But when truth is spoken, even the most fragile hand can carry the weight of justice. And Ethan's story became a reminder that identity is never weakness. It is the thread that ties us to those who came before, and it can turn even the smallest diner into a sanctuary of dignity. And now I ask you, if you were Ethan, carrying scars the world tried to use against you, would you have had the courage to keep standing until the truth arrived? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if Ethan's journey moved you, don't forget to follow Heart Stories for more stories that honor the strength found in the shadows.